Okay, are we, do I have a sound here? Cool, great. Hello, everybody, hi. Welcome to Taking Cues. This is the second episode in the series, and yeah, so I'm happy to be here, excited. Thanks for watching. My name is Eli, by the way. So last week we talked about some celestial ideas, and you know, it was very out there, very in the stars and in space, and we were talking about a lot of things that maybe didn't seem kind of vague or metaphorical or whatever. Today, I think we're just going to stay on the earth. You know, we're going to be more on the ground today. So we're going to start with, oh, and I got my quilting Taking Cues hat here. And it's reversible, but I don't want to flip it to the other side because it's a little pointy and I think it looks a little too much like a female nipple, so we don't want to get banned again. So I'm just going to leave it on this side. All right, so I am going to start today by reading an essay. I didn't write the essay, but I think it's a really good essay to read when we're learning about the history of quilting, because when you look at the way quilting has been historicized, it's pretty one-sided. A lot of it just focuses on the white quilters that were making art, and you know, this sort of idea, this very American habit of erasure and historical erasure. So we're going to read this essay about a quilter named Harriet Powers that I learned about when I was first learning how to do quilting. And she's widely known, but her history is kind of not very filled in. You know, there's a lot of mystery. And I learned about this essay, which was written by Gladys Marie Fry from a blog by a woman named Kyra Hicks, who has a wonderful quilting blog online. And she's a children's book writer. And yeah, so she turned me on to this particular essay by Gladys Marie Fry. And the essay is called A Sermon in Patchwork, New Light on Harriet Powers. So I'm going to go ahead and read this. And also, it's kind of a long essay. It'll take maybe 25 minutes or so to read. So I would invite you all to, you know, make some art if you feel inclined. If you have a project that you're working on, take it out and do some drawing or whatever it is. And there will be time at the end to call in. And I hope you do, and tell me about what you're working on. So, I guess without further ado, I'll go ahead and start. Again, this is called A Sermon in Patchwork, New Light on Harriet Powers by Gladys Marie Fry. Since I first began writing about the African-American quilter Harriet Powers in the early 1970s, interest in her life and work has greatly increased. She has been the subject of numerous essays, a book for children, and an off-Broadway play by Grace Cavallari entitled Quilting in the Sun. Oh, one more thing. The link to this essay is in the chat on Twitch, so if you want to read along, if you're like me and you can process things better when you're actually reading them along, go ahead and click on that link and you can follow along. In addition to a good deal of information about her life has come to light as a result of a project dedicated to her that was undertaken jointly in 1993 by the University of Maryland and the Smithsonian Institute. That project's research has given substance to a biography hitherto short on even the simplest facts. The quilts themselves have been subject of wide-ranging discussions. Scholars in conference and in print have explicated the meaning of Powers' work. Generally, they have seen in it evidence, on the one hand, of a highly religious Christian woman using her art to spread faith, and on the other, of a clever artist who used Bible stories to introduce her work, into her work, African images and ideas that might otherwise have been forgotten. This discussion is likely to continue for some time as who Harriet Powers was emerges. The consensus is that Powers was an artist of considerable power and ingenuity, although altogether worthy of the critical attention she has received. Seldom has a quilter been so much discussed, puzzled over, and revered. For all this interest and activity, little written material by people who actually met Powers exists, and what there is must be considered in light of attitudes towards African Americans held by most Southerners in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Most authentic material is a description of Powers, and the first of her two Bible quilts by Jenny Smith, an art teacher who lived in Athens, Georgia, a town near Powers' home. It was Smith who first came into possession of a Powers work and who brought the quilter to the attention of the art world. An article by Lucine Finch, A Sermon in Patchwork, which appeared in the October 28, 1914 issue of Outlook magazine, provides another, in some ways even more provocative look at Powers. It not only provides a word portrait of the artist, but also comments briefly on the meaning of the Bible quilt panels. It thus represents an important extension of the Harriet Powers legacy. In this essay, I would like to discuss exactly what Finch's essay has, is that her name? No, Lucine Finch, yeah. Exactly what Finch's essay has added to our knowledge of this unusual quilter and give some background on the article's author, who is almost as elusive as Powers herself. The quilt changes hands, the Jenny Smith connection. The Harriet Powers story, as the world knows it, began one remarkable day in 1891 when Powers and her husband, Armistead, made their way by ox cart from their Clark County, Georgia farm to the university town of Athens. With them, carried in a crocus sack, was Powers' first quilt, which she intended to sell to Jenny Smith, a teacher at the Athens Lucy Cobb Institute, a school for girls. When, after a period of increasing prosperity for the Powers family, time had suddenly grown hard, Powers remembered an offer she had had from Smith to buy the quilt, which Smith had seen in 1886 at an agricultural fair. According to Jenny Smith's written record, she purchased the quilt for $5, though the asking price was $10, an indication of how desperate the Powerses must have been for money. That it was difficult for Powers to part with the quilt is evident, for she returned to the Smith residence on several occasions to see it. In the course of these visits, she explained something of the panel's meanings to Smith, who, luckily for future art historians and folklorists, recorded those explanations. In 1895, Smith exhibited the quilt at the Cotton States and International Exposition in Atlanta, where it attracted the attention of faculty wives at Atlanta University. Several of these women, struck by the originality and beauty of the quilt, commissioned Powers to make a second. That second work eventually came into the possession of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, its current owner. The one bought by Smith, now housed in the textiles division of the Smithsonian Institute, represents the only other surviving work from the artist's hand. Smith was curiously negligent about the quilt she had gone to such trouble to buy. Her meticulous will made no mention of it. According to her executor, Hal Hecklin, the quilt was included among the odds and ends of her estate. It was Hecklin who eventually donated the quilt to the Smithsonian Institute, along with a 16-page letter by Smith describing the quilt and the Outlook article by Lucine Finch. A brief overview of Powers' life and her artistic inspiration. Jenny Smith knew little about the quilter who had surrendered her masterpiece, but in its outward circumstances, as far as we know, Powers's life was not highly unusual for a woman of her race and time. Powers had been born a slave on October 29, 1837, and often talked to her patron about the days before the Civil War, a topic undoubtedly common in conversation between Southern whites and blacks at the time. Like most former slaves, Powers was illiterate but generally shrewd in her business dealings, as various deeds and contracts in her name show. After 1894, she and her husband separated, and thereafter she lived independently in the country, paying her own taxes and perhaps earning her living as a seamstress. Unfortunately, with advancing age, her income so declined that when she died at age 74 in 1911, her estate was much reduced from what it had been 10 years before. Like most African Americans of her era, she worked hard all her life and had done whatever was necessary to raise her family in a society that placed little value on the lives and fortunes of African Americans. Certainly, she could never have expected that her work and her artful quilts would one day be the focus of so much attention. The Bible quilt, which I believe is pulled up on the screen, that Jenny Smith purchased was an interesting and ingenious combination of Bible stories, African motifs, and meteorological phenomena, like the spectacular Leonid star shower of the 1833 that had become part of the African American folk memory. The quilt was constructed using the applique technique, a quilting method popular during the period in which pre-cut figures are sewn onto a blank background. The quilt contains 11 panels, or framed narrative scenes, in which Powers captures the stories of Bible characters like Adam and Eve, Jacob, Satan, and Jesus. Over half the panels are devoted to the story of the Garden of Eden, and the life of Jesus figures in several others. The African element in the quilt can be seen in its design, its construction technique, and its use of narrative. The work, in fact, resembles the tapestries of the Fon people of West Africa, who also use the applique technique extensively. The Fon tapestries feature figures sewn onto a black or gold background, many of them animals that were totem representations of 11 significant kings. Perhaps because they are not portraits of real animals, these figures are pictured in unusual colors like green, blue, purple, and white, and at times have an abstract quality. At the same time, the Fon tapestries illustrate well-known stories or proverbs in the Fon culture. Powers makes extensive use of uniquely realized animal figures, and like the Fon with the stories of kings, present in pictorial form, Old Testament stories that had become part of the African American oral tradition. Finally, the astronomical bodies in her panels have, along with their connections to the folk history of African Americans, distinct African associations. The sun, which figures prominently in both her quilts, for instance, is an African symbol for the concept of circularity and the omniscience of God. Lucine Finch, a second eyewitness. The African roots of the quilt were not known to Jenny Smith or to any other white viewer until recent years, when scholars of African art looking at Powers' work immediately associate it with figures and signs familiar to them from their research. Certainly those roots were not known to the Alabama writer Lucine Finch when, 3 years after Harriet Powers' death, she published her article about Powers' quilt. Lucine Finch was, however, acquainted with African American folkways. Her mother, Julia Neely Finch, was a well-known collector of mammy songs, and she herself would write a series of vignettes featuring former slaves she had known. She and Jenny Smith, the sole eyewitnesses to the Harriet Powers story, who committed their views to paper, were similar in several interesting ways. Both were well-born and well-bred. Jenny Smith's father had been a successful cotton buyer in Athens, and Lucine Finch came from a distinguished Birmingham family. Both were unmarried artistic ladies who supported themselves through their art. They may well have met through Smith's brother, Wales, a popular journalist on a Birmingham daily, and it is possible that Jenny introduced Lucine to Powers. Lucine Finch was younger than Jenny Smith, and her artistic ambitions were equally high. Smith had studied art not only in the distinguished schools in America, but in Paris. Finch's first love was music, and she was sufficiently good at it that she gave regular concerts, including one at Carnegie Hall in February 1919. A letter to her mother stresses her excitement about not only the performances, but the money she would be paid for them. "Well, tomorrow is the eventful day where I make my first $150 fee for an hour's recital," she said. She noted brightly. "The next night, I have my one at Carnegie Hall, for which I hope to make $50. In the same letter, she speaks of a manager pressing to represent her, an indication of how seriously she was being taken in some quarters. But while she continued giving recitals well into the 1920s, even going on regular tours, her repertoire was, by her own admission, limited, and over time her engagements dwindled. Lucine Finch seems to have been one of those individuals who had, by any normal standard, outstanding talents in many directions, but none of sufficient quality to bring sustained recognition. As with music, so with her writing. She published poetry, short stories, and the previously mentioned series of vignettes called Slaves Who Stayed, but only 2 books, which earned her no notable critical or popular success. She was also deeply interested in drama. One of her books had been a play in verse, and in addition to her concert work, she was paid to stage dramas in the wealthy suburb of Connecticut. There, though herself far from wealthy, she spent the decade, eventually opening a shop to supplement her income. During the 1920s, Finch also took responsibility for her ailing mother, from whom she refused to be parted. The Finch Interview and its Limitations. Finch's article on Harriet Powers in Outlook shows Finch to have been a Southern-bred woman of her time, more than a little patronizing about the mental and emotional qualities of African Americans. The article begins with a general regret that the old-timey Negro, in other words, the former slave, was disappearing. The author takes Powers to be a good example of such a Negro and adopts the liberties one might expect. She does not give the circumstances of the interview, the background of the subject, or a physical description of her. Lucine Finch never identifies Powers by name, referring to her simply as an aged Negro woman. And she sees the quilt not as a work of art, but only as the reverent, worshipful embodiment of an old colored woman's soul. Undoubtedly, the maker's reverence and worshipfulness are a part of the quilt's power, but much that Finch takes for granted looks like the artful camouflage on the quilter's part. What the white interviewer sees, for instance, as unintentional humor, is to the modern onlooker a quality of whimsy consciously built into the work. Indeed, throughout the article, the reader is aware of many hesitancies and quiet evasions in Powers' words and expressions that the writer misses entirely. Harriet Powers discusses her quilt. The article, in fact, reveals Powers' attitudes and personality. After the introduction, it proceeds to the 11 panels of the quilt, and Powers comments on them. These comments are written in dialect, at the time practically a literary convention in transcribing the words of African Americans, but the ideas are precise. Powers presents herself as an artist working out of the deep sense of personal humility many first-rate artists feel in approaching their work, of thankfulness for the artwork as a given, as received rather than produced, and of herself as a channel through which a greater power was speaking. She says that her intention was to preach the gospel in patchwork, to show my Lord my humility. In other words, the oral tradition of the African American slave, through which all religious beliefs and legends were communicated, is transmuted into the rich African American visual tradition. Moreover, in the patchwork, pieces of fabric otherwise unusable, the quilter finds a fitting metaphor for herself as the humble individual willing to offer herself and her talents to a great task. Could this humility have been opposed? Possibly, considering the skill Southern African Americans achieved in communicating self-effacement in the presence of whites. Yet the religious feeling Powers brought to her work is undoubtedly genuine, and much of it must have been evident in her life. One of her sons, we know, became a minister. Whatever her intent in construing her claim and her metaphor, however, she establishes here yet another important characteristic in her makeup, a highly poetical sense of language. She discusses her work pithily and at times cryptically in the article, and in her metaphors gives evidence of that abstract quality of mind that is clearly visible in her designs, but she also remarks with more than a hint of the prophetic in her voice that the quilt will not simply tell a story but make plain an event of universal importance. Having established herself as the humble artist, she feels empowered to enter onto a great theme. This here quilt going to show where sin originated, out in the beginning of things, the 5 panels of the Garden of Eden story. Powers' reference to the first panel shows her keen sense of humor, some of it directed at herself, but also the care with which the quilt has been wrought. Lucine Finch praises her fine stitching, but must have been surprised at the meaning invested in every figure. Even the smallest item is significant. Powers knows exactly why a figure was portrayed in a certain way. For instance, the devil, in the form of a snake, is presented with feet. An obvious reference to God's curse on the snake in the book of Genesis, that it would forever, after the events in the garden, move on its belly. The reason given for the feet is humorous, but not without serious implications. To get around man, child. Here is our first indication of how very aware Powers was of the symbolic quality of her work. The feet are not merely feet, but a sign of guile, which itself points in later panel to an even more mysterious and terrible qualities of the devil. In the same panel, Powers illustrates forbidden fruit or original sin. The figure with which she represents original sin is a dressmaker's form, drawing from the astute Miss Finch an exclamation point. Here the form signifies not only the vanity through which Eve is traditionally supposed to have been seduced by the devil, but also, with delicious and comic and ironic effect, Powers' own talents as a seamstress. Asked about the intricate trimming around the neck, Powers responds that it was designed to catch the eye of mortal man. That is one of the aims of her quilt as well, indicating that catching the eye of mortal man was, at the least, a morally ambiguous act. The next panel continues the symbolism and the moral message. It represents Adam and Eve in the presence of a peacock, added to symbolize their proudness before the fall, an extension of the idea of the dressmaker's form. Interestingly, the dressmaker's form and the peacock are female and male symbols, respectively, a hint that Powers might not have been content with the traditional view of the fall as the consequence of Eve's sin alone. Where there is iniquity in the story, there is also equity. Not for the first time in the quilt, Powers seeps forth in feminist guise. The third panel is one of the quilt's most striking. It represents Satan in the 7 stars, the 7 stars being the Pleiades. Shorn of his creaturely mask in the garden, the devil appears in his real form, a black figure with one pink eye, sinister in its effect, Finch comments. The movement from the local events in the garden to the dominant place of evil in the universe here goes back to Powers' intention of explaining how evil sprang from the beginning of things. She is not entirely forthcoming about this figure, however. The devil's other eye is behind, and the wiser than this one, she says. Asked to explain why Satan is holding one of the stars, she replies, "There ain't no telling that. No telling that." Such is the weight of meaning of all the other figures in the panels that show that Powers probably could have given a direct answer had she so chosen. Perhaps she only wanted to exaggerate the mystery of the figure. Perhaps she was commenting on the ultimate knowability of the great powers of the universe. Perhaps she was working out of a symbolism rooted in African lore that Lucine Finch would not have understood. Or perhaps she knew that to explain too much about a work of art is to risk explaining it away, and remains so to this day. To risk explaining it away. One of her most powerful figures in this case remained a secret and remains so to this day. Panels 4 and 5 focus on the story of Cain. Powers establishes here firmly a major part of her color scheme. Positive figures like Abel are portrayed in white, and negative, or at least morally ambiguous ones like Cain, in what Lucine Finch calls drab or black. Abel also has sheep, which are sewn in white, along with the small doves pictured in the first two panels, we see here the visual interconnections in the panels that lead up to the appearance of Christ the Lamb, as well as the Holy Ghost, of Cain's slaying of his brother. Abel Powers remarks that the stream of blood from Abel's death wound is flowing over the whole world. In other words, Cain's act ushers death into the world, just as Christ's crucifixion and resurrection later bring in life, attained through the shedding of his blood. In such instances, Powers proves that she is theologian enough to know that the creation story in Christian belief prefigures Christ's coming. It is no small matter, however, that the color white in much African symbolism is associated with the supernatural. Further, in panel 5, we see another possible African symbol, the lion, associated with Cain, according to Powers, for to prove the strength of Cain. Such use is reminiscent of the fawn tapestries, where animals are portrayed not for their own sake, but as totems of kings. Panel 6 shows Jacob's wrestling with the angel in a dream. Powers whimsically remarks about the spotted ladder. I couldn't turn myself loose in color, honey. The animals, calico, obliged to run over in the ladder. There wasn't no other way. This explanation provides yet another instance of Powers' artistic eye at work. It reminds us that she makes two kinds of statements about the quilt in the article. The first about meaning, related to the traditional Christian story, at which we are invited to experience wonder. The second is about craft. The first falls into the category of mystery, the second of knowledge. Powers is never more sure of herself than when she explains why she adopted a certain color or design, saying flatly that there could be no other approach to the subject. But there is yet another arresting feature of this panel. The angel with whom Jacob wrestles is female. Quite apart from the possibility that the angel is an anima figure, Powers again takes a proto-feminist stance, countering traditional illustrations of such angels as male. Panel 6 also operates as a bridge between the story of the fall in the Old Testament and the story of Christ in the New. The choice of subjects for the panel is particularly apt because it shows a man at odds with God as a result of the fall, summing up the entire human experience from Adam to Jesus in one panel. A remarkable example of Powers' narrative economy. The 5 panels present in the life of Christ, in contrast to the Old Testament story with its linear development, dispense with chronology. They are ordered as follows: Christ's baptism, the crucifixion, Judas's betrayal, the Last Supper, and a portrait of the Holy Family. Powers carefully chooses her emphasis to balance the older story. For instance, the baptism, in which the dove of the first 2 panels reappears, symbolizes the rebirth of the spiritual in the world, severed by the events of the fall. Powers says that the dove is kissing him, and John leading him by the hand like a child, stressing not only Christ's renascent spiritual quality, but also his humility, which stands in such contrast to the pride of Adam and Eve in panels 1 and 2. Panel 8, the crucifixion, counters the image of Cain's killing of Abel. Powers sews 3 sons into this panel to show the various stages in the event. Lucine Finch, quoting Powers, says, "First it, the sun, is black, the rays white, when darkness comes over the world in that minute. Then it is white, when the good Lord accepted, and then turned to blood. Also in red is the wound in Christ's side." The phrase, "when the good Lord accepted," harkens back to the initial dispute between Cain and Abel, which revolved around a sacrifice. God accepted Abel's sacrifice and rejected Cain's, just as here Christ's sacrifice is accepted. Powers makes one remark that seems to baffle Finch: "Wipe it out in the world, wipe it out in the world." Yet these words are not so difficult to interpret. The "it" is original sin, and its sign, the blood shed by Cain. Christ's blood has come to wipe out the stain of both sin and Cain's villainy. Powers was not, as Miss Finch assumes, being mystical. The 9th panel shows Judas with his 30 pieces of silver, the man of sin, the human equivalent of the devil in the 3rd panel. Referring to the silver coins, Powers says, "Missy Coombe counted them for me, 'cause I can count them backwards, same as I can count them forwards, and that ain't no way to count. I have been unable to identify Missy Coombe, but the notion of counting backwards is a part of the folklore associated with witches and conjurers. To do anything backwards is to upset the proper order of the world for evil purposes. Thus, counting backwards is no way to count. Further strengthening the identification of this panel with panel 3, Powers produces a disc at the bottom, representing the whole world with sin on top of it. Lucine Finch's discussion of panel 10, The Last Supper, marks the last time we hear Powers' voice. Once again, she is concerned with the design element of her quilt. "I give the Lord a plate," she says. "I couldn't spare no plate for the disciples." This seems a small point indeed, but great works of art are made of many small points considered. In such comments, we see the working out of not only Powers' meticulousness, also represented, for instance, by the fineness of her stitches, but also in her keen ability to see the relation of parts to the whole and to use symbols precisely. Christ alone has a plate because he is the true feast of the Last Supper from which all will feed. As always, her artistic economy is striking. The final panel presents the Holy Family, the antitype of the family of Adam and Eve. What begins with a family ends with a family. The individuals who produce the beginning of history are replaced by the individuals whose appearance heralds history's end. A certain circularity is involved, though the idea of loss and restoration is foremost. Lucine Finch's article ends at this point rather sentimentally, as she notes in her own wistfulness in the presence of the quilt and her view of it as deriving from the unbidden pathos of the deep heart in all its sincerity. As I have tried to show, however, there is much more involved. Powers' comments both reveal her personality, invisible until the recovery of Lucine Finch's article, except for what could be inferred from her quilts, and show how her mind worked, its basic generosity, and its ability to deal with dramatic and complex events in concise form. Since the early 1970s, much has come to light about Harriet Powers. The layers in which her life has been concealed have slowly been peeled away. Her life, family, and background are now, to a greater extent than ever before, accessible. But there is still so much to learn and much work still to be done. For example, I have suggested that Harriet Powers may have encoded African images into her quilt. If so, for what purpose? Was she engaged in Africanizing Christianity? Was the quilt really visual means of passing on oral material about an African belief system? Did Harriet Powers fill a role in the African American community apart from her apparent roles as mother, good Christian, and quilt maker? In investigations of this kind, one hopes the core of Powers' story will be revealed. There's one more section in this article, but I'm gonna leave it out because just in the efforts of time, preserving time, because we only have like an hour, maybe an hour and 15 or something. But it's very good, it's a very good section, so I would encourage you all to click on that link and read that last section. It just talks about how Gladys Marie Fry came to understand and know Harriet Powers' work, and just a little bit of the story of how she made this connection. Basically, Harriet Powers only has 2 quilts that have survived, and Gladys Marie Fry was the one who connected the 2, so that now we all know that they were both made by the same person. Okay, whew. I'm going to take a break for a minute. Yeah. All right, so what I really love about that article is it gives so much context into how history is told, right? We don't know that much about Harriet Powers, and what we do know is known from these white article writers who really weren't that tactful in their depictions of Powers, which made sense for the time. So, yeah, and the other thing that I really love about the way Fry talks about Powers' work is that she talks about how Powers, in her own words, is describing herself as a channel for this inspiration, right? Not as the creator of this work. What did she say? Well, in any case, you know what I mean. Someone who is interpreting a story rather than being the creator of the story, right? I think this idea is really powerful, and it's very inspiring to me because, essentially, the blank page is a terrifying thing. It's very scary to look at just a canvas or a blank page and just try to create something from within your brain. You can't do that. You need to have an input. You need to have some kind of thing that you're channeling from. So, can you pull up the nature slideshow? So, quilters do this a lot. They use, most quilting patterns come from things in nature or things that humans create, right? So, this first pattern is called a bear paw, right? So, we can see that it's just 4 bear paws, right? Next slide. This one is one of my favorites, honeycomb, okay? This is one of the most beautiful examples of the honeycomb pattern, and also just one of the most beautiful, I think, examples of this communication that we were talking about last week, right? The hexagon is something that has existed in nature for so long. I mean, bees create this. That's why it's called the honeycomb. That, if it's not these laws of geometry communicating with nature, communicating with the world, if that's not a communication, then I really don't know what is. And I want to just draw your eye to the center of this, where you have this 6-pointed star in the middle. If you look really closely at that, you can see that 6-pointed star is composed of hexagons, tiny half-inch hexagons that, I mean, if you go to the Met website and you look at this, this is where I found this example. It's a really good resource for looking at quilts. Let me see if I can pull up this date here. Where are you? Come on. Well, I had the date pulled up, but now it's gone, so never mind. All right, next slide. Okay, oak leaf. This is an oak leaf pattern. Another beautiful nature-inspired example. All right, next one. This one I think is incredible. It's made by an Amish community, and there's nothing specifically related to nature in the description of this quilt, but when I look at this quilt, I see jagged rocks, I see texture, natural texture. I see a cliff face. And this quilt, I don't remember the exact date, but I know it was made before 1900, and I just can't believe how beautiful this one Amish example is. It's called the Tumbler's Crazy Quilt, also on the Met website. Go to the next one. This one is called Wild Goose Chase, okay? This quilt pattern is one that's used all over the place, right? We see this in American quilts, for a long time. Next one. Okay, this quilt is by Rosie Lee Tompkins. This is a contemporary quilt. And I don't really know why I put this in nature category. I think because it reminded me of like leaves falling from a tree, just the way the colors are distributed. I just see that it's not totally random distribution, but it just falls in this way that reminds me of how nature, how leaves fall, the way the colors are distributed. Okay, next one. This is another crazy quilt. And I mean, look at this. It's a bird. It's a curled up cat or a bird or some kind of, natural inspiration, right? Okay, let's go to the next slideshow. Another thing people take inspiration from is things made by humans. there's a quilt pattern called Schoolhouse, and this is one that has been used for, 150 years. There's another one called Sawtooth, which is sort of like a little jagged thing like that. Actually, last week when we did the North Star quilt pattern, we actually used a technique that you can use to make the sawtooth pattern as well. Next slide. Okay, so now, basically, you may be familiar with this artist named Tom Sachs. So he in his studio has this like booklet that's called the 10 Bullets, and it's like a guidebook, like a rule book for how to go for it. I mean, it's a guidebook to explain to people who are working in his studio how to follow the rules, all the rules that you need to follow, right? One of the bullets is called creativity is the enemy, okay? And this is an idea that I think has a lot to do with this sort of like finding inspiration in natural things, finding inspiration in human-made things. Creativity is the enemy in terms of Tom Sachs' studio means follow the rules. Don't make shit up, Make sure you, if you have an idea, build it on the ideas that are already there. It's a bit of a militaristic way to interpret this rule, but I think another way to look at it is this idea that whatever you make, you're always being inspired by something around you, right? And it's sort of inevitable. Creativity is the enemy. Creativity really is inconsequential, right? All these beautiful artworks are inherently inspired by nature and by the things around us. So it's also a tool that I like to use when I'm making art. So again, as I said before, like the blank page is something that's totally terrifying to me. And I don't like sitting with my thoughts. I don't like, deciding I'm going to make a piece of art and then thinking, what do I want to make a piece of art about? That's not a fun way to do it for me. What I like to do is to find references and things that I can pull from. That's where the creativity comes in. And it sort of happens automatically because I've already laid out these inspirations in front of me, so I don't have to decide where they're going to come from, right? So we've got this staircase pulled up. You can see that. Okay, so one thing that I take a lot of inspiration from, and a project I've had in mind for a while, is this sort of like westward expansion that's happening in Fishtown. Actually, it's just expansion. It's not westward expansion. I guess it's like a manifest destiny of Philadelphia, and all these developers. There's just constantly things going down and coming up, and what they leave are these like traces of the buildings that were there before, right? So, next slide. We can see in this one. Okay, wait, go to the previous slide, the first one, the staircase one. So we see this staircase. This is from where a staircase was attached to a wall. They've knocked that building down. All these plants, grew up or whatever, and the staircase image is left over, right? Okay, next slide. I'm also inspired by the architecture that I see around me. I know this is sideways, but just, it's not really about the building. This is a building in Brooklyn near the Williamsburg Bridge. I don't know who designed it, but I thought this weird wavy pattern was incredible and very strange. Next slide. This is light falling onto a brick pattern in an old public school in Philly. And the light is being filtered through these grates on an exterior sort of balcony. All right. Next slide. This one I believe is sideways as well. Something people do when they decide to paint is just paint part of a wall. I don't know why they decide to do this, but I think this is a beautiful image that could be quilted. And, you could be looking at me and saying, Eli, this is just a door in the side of a warehouse. And if that's your take, that's fine. That's totally cool. Next slide. Another door. This one, I don't know. I don't really have anything else to say about this other than I think it's beautiful and worthy of quilting. Okay, next one, a wider view of this same thing. And the next one, oh God, this one's just beautiful. I just see in this all this contemporary art that's just sort of accidental. It's just, where the hell does this come from? Nobody means to put this stuff there, but you have this nice thing in the top corner. I think this is one is sideways too, right? So it would be just in the left top corner. Those are glass bricks, and the sunlight is being filtered through those glass bricks. And I don't know, I'm in love with glass bricks. I love them. All right, next slide. This is the facade of the Esslingers building, which is outside of this very building where we are located right now. It's just down the street on Callow Hill, I think. And I think this facade is wonderful, and I think it reminds me of patchwork. All right, last slide. Okay, this one is one that we're going to work on today. It's another one of those instances where there was a building in this field, and it was torn down, and here you can see these two diagonal lines that are basically all that's left of the staircases that were there. So, what is this? This is history speaking to us in an image. Eventually, this building is going to be gone too, because all that shit right around American Avenue is just going to be flattened, and it's all going to be built into condos. So we won't be able to look at this for that much longer. And it's already telling us something about the loss of a neighborhood. I don't know. I think this is worth memorializing in some way. So I've had this idea about a project. I guess you can go ahead and turn the slideshows off. To make a quilt using these images. So I went ahead and made a little transparency of this one. I guess now it's 7:55. We can go ahead and turn the phone lines on. So I'm gonna work on this project here, and I can talk about it or I can not. My voice is a little kind of running out of steam here, but I'd love to talk to some of you. So call in, tell me your quilt stories. I want to hear your quilt stories. Is there a quilt in your life that means a lot to you that you want to tell me about and tell the rest of the audience about? 2, is there a piece of art that you're working on right now that you want to tell me about? 3, I don't know, call and say hi. I'll just be using my phone and I'm going to put you on speaker here. So the number's on the screen. I'm going to start working. Yeah. So I don't always use projection when I'm doing quilts. In fact, I rarely do. But I like it just for this show, and sometimes I used it for one where I was doing like an image of a chair, and I really needed to get the shading right and the image right. So what I'll do is I'll trace the lines on here, and this is a big piece of paper, and then I will take an X-Acto knife or scissors or something and cut out the shapes that I'm making, and then use the shapes as templates for fabric. And that way I can just slowly replace paper with fabric, and then in the end, I'll have all my pieces. Anyway, I'm gonna stop talking. I know I said creativity is the enemy beforehand, but this does require a little bit of creativity. Just, obviously I'm not going to replicate this brick for brick at this size. So I am making some decisions here as to what constitutes a piece. But I think it tricks my brain, I can trick my brain into thinking it's just sort of following a rule, Also, I am simplifying this, obviously, but I'm doing it in such a way that will help me when I come to piece this thing. Because piecing certain shapes, certain angles is difficult. It's one of those things that you kind of just have to learn through making mistakes. That's the only way. Trying to be calmer than Bob Ross here. I'm way calmer than Bob Ross. It's not a contest. Really? No calls yet? I'm judging you. Who's got the guts? I'm really just gonna talk to you. Like, I'm afraid of being humiliated and pranked on the phone. So, here, someone's calling me. My dad. Oh, wonderful. Hi, Dad.
Well, hi, Eli. How you doing?
I'm good. Are you watching right now?
I am, but I stepped out of the room so I could talk with you without any kind of reverberation or anything. Am I, is this private or am I on
No,
the air?
you're on the air. I've got you on speakerphone,
Well,
so your voice is being picked
okay.
up by the microphone.
Well, Eli,
Can you hear it? Can you all hear it on the...
Yeah,
Can you
I'm
hear my
fine.
dad's? Okay.
Is
What?
everything good?
Yeah, what, Dad?
Well, your mom and I are watching and we're really enjoying it. We hardly recognize you. You're so grown up and so in command and organized and know what you're saying and communicating your vision for quilting. It's wonderful to see you. You're really enthusiastic about it. You have a vision of what quilting is, taking it from nature and from the world outside, not just nature, but urban things, and it's really nice to see you.
Thanks,
Now
Dad.
you're working through your process, and I'm really glad that
Thanks.
you're doing this.
Thanks. Well, I've had a lot of time to think about it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, your mom is a quilter with her quilting group, and
Oh, yeah.
you must have inherited some interest and ability from her. It's really great. I have very little experience with quilts. I do have a story about a quilt that might serve as a cautionary tale for your listeners.
Okay, all right. Let's hear it.
Well, so when I was a little kid living in Brooklyn in Brownsville neighborhood, which is kind of like your Fishtown neighborhood, very urban, and anyhow. So the bed had a quilt on it, and I'm about 5 years old, I think, and there was a tear in the quilt so that you could get inside the batting in the inside.
Ooh.
And I would have a great time going from compartment to compartment inside the batting, and I would spend a lot of time going inside the quilt and, exploring, and I really enjoyed it. It was kind of cozy and warm and exciting, You
Yeah.
could forget that you were inside a quilt on a bed in a room, I was going on an adventure, exploring.
Oh, wow.
And that was great, but one day, my brother, who is 3 years younger, unbeknownst to me, he followed me inside the quilt. So I'm going from compartment to compartment, and I turn around and he's following me. And I reach the last compartment, and I'm turning around to go back, and I can't find the exit. Because he's sitting on it. He's sitting on the exit to the next compartment. Ooh. So I kind of freak out.
Oh, no.
And in my freaking out, I must have moved him out of the way. We scooted out there. I don't think I ever went back in there. And later on, as an adult, when we moved to Kentucky, and I used to go to the caves here, like Mammoth Cave and everything.
Yeah.
I had this sickening feeling, like I wanted to be brave, but I really wasn't. It would make me ill. And I trace it back to that time inside that quilt. So let your viewers know it's a cautionary tale. Quilts are wonderful, but please observe them from the outside. There's no reason to go inside. There's nothing to be gained.
Yeah.
Okay?
That's a good point. All right. Thanks, Dad.
All right. Nice talking to you.
Yeah, you too. I'll talk to you later.
Good luck with your program. Bye-bye now.
Okay, bye-bye. All right. Nice call from my dad. So he says, don't go inside the quilt. Seems like something sort of maybe a little more traumatic. Reason why that memory may have stayed is just the private element of being inside a quilt and then having that whole thing being discovered, you know. Reminds me of when I used to like put pillows inside my shirt and like pretend like I was obese and like I never wanted anybody to see me doing like that, you know. I just, as soon as someone would come in, I would just take the pillow out of my shirt and hide it, like, you know. And then one time I fell asleep with the pillow inside my shirt, and I remember my mom got pictures of me with this fish pillow inside my shirt, and I was like so mortified. I was so embarrassed. I bet she doesn't even remember. Do you remember that, Mom? Anyway, we're gonna get another call here. Let's see. It's 8:08. Go for another 10 minutes. How about that? Is that cool? All right. Hello, you're on Taking Cues.
Hi, Eli.
Hello, Caroline. How's it going?
It's good. How are you?
Great. Are you watching the show right now?
No, I just wanted to see what you were doing. I'm just kidding. I'm watching the show.
Ha 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 ha. So, what's going on?
I guess. Well, I'm thinking about quilting as a concept. And I find myself personally drawn to quilting because as opposed to like drawing and sculpting and painting, the finished result is like something that you could use as a blanket, which I like a lot.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering, in your mind, when comparing quilting to other mediums, like what draws you to quilting like more so than... I just want to know what you like so much about quilting. I mean, I know why I like it, but...
I do love the utilitarian aspect of quilting. Definitely that falls into it. I think that's a big part of it, really. Having the capacity to make something that will be really practical and useful for you, I think is an awesome thing. It makes me feel better, it makes me feel safer somehow. Like, if ever, like, the world collapses and we need to, like, you know, make things for ourselves, I can make a quilt, you know, or I could do carpentry or something, you know, like that. It's the same thing that draws me to like making a spoon or something, you know.
I really like utilitarian art.
Yeah, same.
I gave up. I was drawing for a little bit, but I realized all I can do with my drawings is look at them, and there's so many other things to look at. It kind of felt pointless. But I think quilting's really good.
Have you ever tried it before?
I've never tried it. I'm pretty afraid to get started. It seems like I'm not very good with needles. Do you use a sewing machine for your quilts, or do you do them by hand?
Both. I like to do both. But, you know, you definitely don't need a sewing machine. I think doing it by hand is really satisfying, and it's super easy to learn. I think I would teach you sometime. Or maybe next week we can do like a super beginner lesson on sewing or quilting.
That would be awesome.
You know, something that can be like really, you can just start out.
I can picture a lot of a lot of participants that I work with. I think would be really interesting and really interested in this medium too. I can picture Deweese like kind of running with his
Really?
designs
I totally
in a
can
quilt-like
too.
form.
Yes, totally. I love Deweese's art. That's Deweese White Designs. Follow him on Instagram.
Oh yeah, thanks, Eli.
Totally.
Yeah,
I mean, I love
He's
Deweese.
an amazing worldwide clothing. He's looking for collaboration opportunities. So.
I would collaborate with Deweese. I think Deweese should come on Lino Kino Television and do a tutorial on printmaking or something.
Yeah, he would love that. I'll run it by him. He's working on getting Joe Biden's cabinet hoodies.
Oh, that's cool.
They're all going to say congratulations.
That's really cool. I hope he gets that contract.
Yeah, I have to write into Converse to get something for Kamala.
Okay, good luck.
Thanks. Thanks for taking my call and answering all of my questions. I feel even more informed about quilts than I did an hour ago.
Thanks for calling. I appreciate it. And yeah, this is weirdly formal, but have a good night, and I'll talk to you later.
See ya.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
My dad called. Should I call him back? Let's give it like a few more minutes. I'll just call him back after it's over. This up here, I'm totally at a loss. I have no idea how to do this part up here and this part down here. Like, how am I gonna, I just don't know. Obviously this needs to be a square. And obviously this line needs to be here. Oh, yep, Dad. Hey, Dad.
Hey, it's Mom.
Oh, hi. Hello.
Hi. Listen, I was shy to call you and I didn't want us to, like, monopolize your program, but I'm glad that you had somebody else call.
Oh,
but
no, you don't have to
worry
about that. You can...
Yeah, but I had something to add. I mean,
yeah.
you know I've been in a quilting group forever.
I know, yeah.
And I've never really thought of myself as a quilter, you know?
Okay.
And I think of myself as more of a just following a pattern, and somebody gives me something to sew, and I do it, and I'm meticulous, and I can sew well. But when you said, I think your process is really, really cool and really interesting. So it's been fun to watch. But and I also did photography in college and art, and so seeing your pictures of the buildings and patterns and stuff, that's really, really kind of inspiring, And I remember taking pictures, like photographs, kind of like that.
I think I remember seeing some of those pictures in a box somewhere.
Yeah, like different, buildings.
Different buildings, yeah.
The way the light. But, I never really thought about using that kind of thing to make a quilt. So I think that's really, really interesting. And when you said something about, how a blank piece of paper is so scary, well, I totally agree. Because I feel like I'm not really a very creative person. Like, if somebody tells me to do something and gives me something or tells me to cook something, I have to have a recipe. I have to have a...
Yeah. Are you there? Oh, shit. The signal at my parents' house is fucked. I'm going to call you back. Damn, that was good. It's just getting good.
To an automatic voice message system 50.
Maybe her phone died. Yeah, I don't know. I think this idea of creativity is kind of bullshit. Like nobody thinks of anything on their own, you know? We should just get rid of that idea altogether. Mom, if you're watching, you can call me back. Hey.
Hello?
Hey, Mom.
Are you done with the program? I don't
Nope.
know what happened. I cut off.
Yeah, you're still on the air. We're still going.
Oh, I just got cut off. Well, anyway, I was just saying that your idea of using around what's in nature and buildings and stuff is very inspiring, and I don't know that I would ever do it, but it's just a really interesting way to think about creating.
Cool. Yeah.
I mean, I guess the closest thing that I've ever done to what you're doing is when in the quilting group, one time, and I actually have owned this quilt, so we always piece a couple of quilts every year, and then we draw names from a hat, and somebody in the group gets the quilt top, and then they have to quilt it. So we one time did a quilt, and I don't know if you remember this or have seen it, but all the people in the group did their own houses. So you could do it any way you wanted to do it.
Yeah.
And so I did the house where we lived on Rockledge Avenue. And then we put the quilt together. It was like all the houses were in a big courtyard. And then in the middle of the courtyard, we had a clothesline with diapers hanging on the quilt, and all of the children of the quilters had their initials of their kids on the diapers. And I think it was before you were born, because I only had one diaper hanging.
That's amazing.
So, anyway, it's a great quilt, and it's so big that I have nowhere to put it.
I know.
You know. Anyway.
Yeah.
That's
I love that
cool.
quilt. I remember it, and I remember trying to hang it up in the house.
I know. We were going to hang it in the hall, but it was like so big, it would just be crazy.
Yeah.
I guess we need to move to a bigger house.
I guess so.
Anyway, I enjoyed your show a lot, and
Thanks, Mom.
And I'll talk to you soon.
Okay.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye. Well, I think that's a wonderful place to draw things to a close. If you get a copy of the zine, the Lino Kino zine for this project, then I have a piece in there where I talk about that exact quilt. So read that if you want. And thank you, Mom and Dad, for calling. Thank you, Caroline. I'm going to keep working on this. And, and thank you to my helpers here in the studio. And as always, tune in to all the other shows that are happening on Lino Kino television. We still got like half of this whole thing left. It's going to be I'm going to be very sad when it's all over. But it's not over yet till Valentine's Day, all right? I'm going to keep working here, but thank you for watching, and good night.